Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence.
Awesome. Let's talk about the extraordinary documentary evidence that we have for Christianity.
It is true that there are things that we believe about history that provide as much evidence as we have for the resurrection of Jesus Christ.
Cool. We're on the same page so far.
And when I bring up the fact that all we have to show for the resurrection of Jesus are some ancient texts that are not even originals and are copies made of copies, people will respond with something like this. They say, well, history's just like that. A lot of things that we believe about history are recorded in copies of ancient texts.
Oh, so documentary evidence isn't good enough to establish a miracle. I smell the rotting corpse of David Hume.
But there are varying levels of belief and varying levels of consequences to those beliefs. I've had people say things like, how do you know George Washington existed? If we're talking about whether or not Jesus existed, I have no problem believing that Jesus was a person that existed historically. We have good reason to believe that.
So the documentary evidence is good enough to establish the existence of Jesus. Thank you at least for not being a mythicist.
But when you say that Jesus died and rose from the dead, I need more evidence than some ancient texts, especially if his rising from the dead is supposed to have implications for my life. This is where critical thinking comes in. We don't believe every single thing that was ever written down in every historical text and then dedicate our lives to it.
Okay, so again, if a group of people witnessed a miracle, whether it was 200 years ago or 2,000 years ago, how would we know about it outside of it being written in ancient text? Yeah, the stakes are a whole lot higher here than believing in George Washington, which is just a mundane claim. But writing decades before David Hume, I think Thomas Sherlock hits the nail on the head here when he writes, "Man rising from the grave is an object of sense, and can give the same evidence of his being alive as any other man in the world can give. So that a resurrection considered only as a fact to be proved by evidence is a plain case. It requires no greater ability in the witnesses than that to be able to distinguish between a man dead and a man alive, point in which I believe every living man thinks himself a judge. I do allow that in this case and others of like nature require more evidence to give them credit than ordinary cases do. You may therefore require more evidence in these than in other cases, but it is absurd to say that such cases admit no evidence when the things in question are manifestly objects of sense." This is where we got to examine the ancient documents and see what their relationship to truth is. Were the original eyewitnesses mistaken? Did the gospel authors come along later and fudge the details? What kinds of evidence do we have for the honest, unembellished nature of the Gospels? If we, after the fact, examine the documents and find that things are explained without difficulty by supposing that a miracle happened, but not without greater implausibility that a miracle didn't happen, well, that, my friend, is evidence for a miracle. Given the high stakes, isn't that all the more reason to examine their testimony rather than reject it just because it's written down in an ancient text?